Captain Sarah Chen had interrogated over 200 enemy combatants during her 7 years in military intelligence, extracting crucial information that prevented dozens of terrorist attacks. Her male colleagues whispered she was too soft-hearted for serious interrogations. On March 15th, when hardened specialists had spent 3 weeks failing to break a war criminal responsible for massacring entire villages, Sarah would walk into that interrogation room and emerge 6 hours later with intelligence that would save thousands of innocent lives. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I still remember the first time someone told me I was too emotional for intelligence work. It was during my 2nd week at Fort Meade, watching a senior interrogator reduce a captured insurgent to tears through what he called enhanced psychological pressure. The prisoner had been providing false information for hours, clearly more terrified of his own people than anything we could do to him. I suggested we try understanding his motivations instead of intensifying his fear. Master Sergeant Rick Kowalski looked at me like I'd suggested we serve the prisoner tea and cookies. "Shun, this isn't social work," he'd said, his voice carrying the condescending tone I'd grown to hate. "Intelligence gathering requires psychological dominance. These people only respond to strength, not sympathy." But sympathy wasn't what I was suggesting. It was strategic thinking. Fear made people say whatever they thought you wanted to hear. Understanding made them tell you what you actually needed to know. The distinction seemed lost on most of my colleagues, who preferred intimidation tactics that felt satisfying but rarely produced actionable intelligence. My approach had evolved during my first deployment to Syria, where traditional interrogation methods were failing spectacularly. Captured ISIS operatives would endure hours of aggressive questioning without revealing anything useful, but 30 minutes of conversation about their families and motivations often yielded intelligence that saved coalition lives. I learned to read micro-expressions, to identify the psychological pressure points that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with understanding what people actually cared about. The technique wasn't revolutionary. It was basic human psychology applied to military intelligence. But in an environment where showing any form of empathy was seen as weakness, my methods were consistently dismissed as too soft, despite their documented effectiveness. My case file showed a 73% success rate in extracting actionable intelligence, compared to the unit average of 31%, but my superiors attributed these results to luck rather than skill. Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Webb had made his opinion clear during my last performance review. "Shun, you're an outstanding analyst, but interrogation requires a certain mindset. You need to be willing to exploit psychological vulnerabilities without getting emotionally involved in the subject's personal circumstances." He'd paused, choosing his words carefully. "Your empathetic nature is admirable, but it's a liability. In high-stakes interrogations where national security depends on breaking hostile subjects quickly." The irony was suffocating. My empathetic nature was precisely what made me effective at understanding hostile subjects. Traditional interrogators tried to break prisoners through external pressure, but I focused on internal motivations. I didn't need to terrify someone into compliance when I could identify what they genuinely wanted and help them see how cooperation served their own interests. But explaining this distinction to superiors who viewed empathy as weakness felt like trying to teach color theory to people who insisted the world was black and white. They saw my success and concluded I was getting lucky with subjects who would have broken under any approach. They never considered that my approach was working because it addressed psychological realities that aggressive tactics actually reinforced. The breaking point came during the Aleppo operation, when I successfully extracted intelligence from a captured bomb maker that led to the discovery of 3 separate terrorist cells. The subject had resisted traditional interrogation for 5 days, but 40 minutes of conversation about his daughter's medical condition convinced him to provide detailed information about upcoming attacks. My report credited the success to establishing emotional rapport that created voluntary cooperation. Colonel Webb's response was predictable. "Chen, we can't build interrogation protocols around emotional manipulation. What happens when you encounter subjects who can't be reached through personal appeals? What happens when national security requires extracting information from someone who has no emotional vulnerabilities to exploit?" I'd tried to explain that emotional intelligence wasn't manipulation, it was understanding. Every person had psychological frameworks that governed their decision-making, and effective interrogation meant identifying those frameworks rather than trying to overwhelm them. But Webb's concerns reflected the institutional assumption that kindness was incompatible with military effectiveness. 6 months later, I found myself assigned to the Counterintelligence Analysis Division at Langley, reviewing interrogation transcripts instead of conducting actual interrogations. My new supervisor, Director Janet Morrison, had made the transfer. Sound like a promotion. "Chen, your analytical skills are too valuable to waste on routine interrogations. We need someone with your psychological insights reviewing high-level intelligence products." Translation: my methods worked, but they made people uncomfortable. Better to utilize my skills in ways that didn't challenge conventional assumptions about how intelligence gathering should operate. I spent my days reading reports written by interrogators who approached every subject the same way, regardless of cultural background, psychological profile, or personal circumstances. The transcripts were exercises in missed opportunities. Subjects who might have provided crucial intelligence were instead brutalized into silence or compliance that yielded false information designed to stop the questioning rather than serve American interests. Reading these failures felt like watching preventable disasters unfold in slow motion. My colleagues in the analysis division treated me with polite professionalism that barely concealed their awareness of my quasi-demotion. They knew my reputation for successful field interrogations, but they also understood that my transfer represented institutional judgment about my suitability for sensitive operations. Success that came through unconventional methods was somehow less valid than failure achieved through approved techniques. Dr. Elizabeth Hartley, the division's senior psychologist, was the only person who seemed to understand my frustration. During one of our regular consultations, she'd observed, "Sarah, you're dealing with an organization that claims to value results, but actually values conformity. Your methods work, but they threaten people who've built their careers on approaches that feel more aggressive." "It's not about aggression," I'd replied. "It's about effectiveness." Traditional interrogation assumes that fear is the most powerful motivator, but fear makes people desperate to escape questioning rather than motivated to provide accurate information. Understanding what people actually want gives you leverage. That intimidation can't match. Hartley had nodded. "You're absolutely right. But you're also threatening the professional identity of interrogators, who've spent years believing that toughness equals effectiveness. Admitting that empathy might be more powerful than intimidation requires them to reconsider everything they think they know about their work." The conversation helped me understand why my success had been so professionally isolating. I wasn't just challenging interrogation techniques. I was challenging fundamental assumptions about strength, weakness, and what it meant to serve American interests effectively. My colleagues couldn't accept that their most deeply held beliefs about military effectiveness might be not just wrong, but counterproductive. But as I sat in my sterile office at Langley, reviewing transcripts of failed interrogations, I had no way of knowing that everything was about to change. A crisis was approaching that would test every assumption the intelligence community had made about psychological warfare, about the relationship between empathy and effectiveness, and about what it truly meant to serve national security interests. The phone call that would change everything came on a Tuesday morning that had started like every other day of bureaucratic exile. I was reviewing interrogation failures from the previous quarter, documenting patterns that no one would ever act upon, when Director Morrison's secretary informed me that I was wanted in the director's office immediately. The urgency in her voice suggested something far more serious than routine administrative business. Walking down the corridor toward Morrison's office, I noticed unusual activity around the Secure Communications Center. Senior analysts were moving between offices with the kind of focused intensity that indicated developing crisis situations. Whatever had prompted my summons was part of something larger, something that required immediate attention from people who'd been sidelined from active operations. Morrison's office door was closed when I arrived, but I could hear multiple voices, engaged in what sounded like heated discussion. When her secretary finally escorted me inside, I found Morrison conferring with Deputy Director Thompson and a man I didn't recognize wearing the uniform of a Navy intelligence officer. Their conversation stopped abruptly when I entered, replaced by the kind of uncomfortable silence that suggested they'd been discussing me specifically. "Chun, sit down," Morrison said, her voice carrying an edge I'd never heard before. "We have a situation that requires your particular expertise." The phrase, particular expertise, felt loaded with implications I couldn't immediately decode. After 6 months of being treated like my skills were too specialized for practical application, the sudden recognition that those skills might be needed suggested something had gone catastrophically wrong with conventional approaches. "Ma'am, what kind of situation?" I asked, settling into the chair opposite Morrison's desk while trying to read the expressions of everyone in the room. "We have a war criminal in custody," Morrison replied. "Someone whose information could prevent attacks that would dwarf anything we've seen before. And 3 weeks of interrogation have produced absolutely nothing." The man they brought me to see was named Viktor Petrov, though that was likely one of dozens of identities he'd used during his 20-year career orchestrating ethnic cleansing operations across Eastern Europe. Morrison slid a thick file across her desk, the contents heavy with photographs that made my stomach turn. Villages burned to the ground. Mass graves discovered months after his forces had moved through regions. Refugee camps filled with survivors whose stories painted pictures of systematic brutality, designed to terrorize entire populations into submission. Petrov was captured 3 weeks ago during a raid on a safe house in Prague, Morrison explained, her voice clinical despite the horrific images spread between us. Intelligence suggests he's planning something he calls Operation Cleanse, targeting civilian populations in at least 4 different countries. The projected casualties run into the hundreds of thousands. Deputy Director Thompson leaned forward, his expression grim. "Chen, we've had our best interrogators working on him around the clock. Kowalski, Martinez, Williams, all the heavy hitters. This man has resisted every technique in our arsenal. He sits in that room like he's attending a business meeting, completely unaffected by anything we throw at him." I studied Petrov's psychological profile, noting details that immediately suggested why traditional intimidation tactics had failed. Childhood spent in Soviet-era orphanages where survival required emotional detachment. Military training that emphasized resistance to psychological pressure. 2 decades of commanding operations where showing weakness meant death. This was someone who'd spent his entire life learning to suppress emotional responses that could be exploited by enemies. What approaches have been attempted? I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. The Navy intelligence officer, who'd introduced himself as Commander Davis, consulted his notes. Standard psychological pressure, sleep deprivation, environmental manipulation, exploitation of phobias, reward and punishment cycles, false flag operations designed to make him believe his associates had betrayed him. Every protocol in the manual. Every protocol designed to break people through external pressure rather than internal understanding. I wasn't surprised they'd failed. Petrov had survived situations far more dangerous than anything an interrogation room could present. Trying to intimidate someone who'd spent decades intimidating others was like trying to frighten a shark with pictures of smaller fish. "Commander, has anyone attempted to understand his motivations rather than simply applying pressure?" I asked. Davis looked at me as if I'd suggested something absurd. "Chun, this man has orchestrated the murder of thousands of innocent people. His motivations are irrelevant. We need information about Operation Cleanse, not psychological insights into why he became a monster." But understanding why someone became a monster was exactly what would allow you to predict their behavior and exploit their psychological blind spots. Monsters weren't born evil. They were created by circumstances that shaped their worldview in ways that made brutality seem logical or necessary. Identifying those circumstances was the key to understanding how their minds worked. "Ma'am, has anyone explored his personal relationships, family connections, or emotional attachments?" I continued, ignoring Davis's obvious skepticism. "Chun, this man has no family," Morrison replied. "His parents died when he was 7. He has no siblings, no spouse, no children that we can identify. Traditional leverage points don't exist." That information was actually encouraging rather than discouraging. People without obvious emotional attachments often had deeper, more carefully hidden psychological vulnerabilities. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Petrov's apparent isolation suggested someone who deliberately eliminated emotional connections to avoid exactly the kind of exploitation my colleagues were attempting. But total emotional detachment was impossible for human beings to maintain. The connections existed, they were just buried beneath layers of professional conditioning. What about his professional relationships? People he's worked with consistently, commanders he's served under, subordinates he's developed personally? I asked. Thompson consulted another file. He's operated primarily through compartmentalized cells. Never works with the same people. Twice, never maintains contact after operations conclude. The man's a ghost professionally as well as personally. I found myself smiling, which clearly confused everyone in the room. They saw Petrov's isolation as making him impossible to read. But I saw it as revealing everything about his psychological architecture. Someone who went to such elaborate lengths to avoid emotional connections wasn't someone who lacked emotions. They were someone who'd been hurt badly enough to build elaborate defenses against further emotional damage. "Ma'am, I'd like to review the interrogation transcripts from the past 3 weeks," I said. "Not the summaries or analysis, but the complete verbatim records of everything he said." Morrison's expression sharpened. "Chun, those transcripts run to over 400 pages. Our analysts have already identified every significant statement and cross-referenced them for actionable intelligence." "With respect, ma'am, I'm not looking for actionable intelligence. I'm looking for psychological patterns that reveal how his mind processes information and relationships." I paused, knowing my next words would either open doors or confirm their assumption that my methods were too abstract for serious intelligence work. Every person reveals who they are through what they choose to discuss and what they choose to avoid. Petrov has been talking for 3 weeks. He's told us exactly who he is, we just haven't been listening in the right way. The silence that followed lasted nearly a full minute. I could see Morrison weighing my request against the institutional pressure to stick with proven methods, even when those methods had proven catastrophically ineffective. Davis was clearly skeptical about psychological analysis that didn't involve direct application of pressure. Thompson seemed caught between hope that my approach might work and concern about authorizing techniques that deviated from established protocols. "Chun, even if your analysis identifies psychological vulnerabilities, we can't authorize interrogation methods that haven't been tested through proper channels," Morrison finally said. "The legal implications alone would be staggering if anything went wrong." "Ma'am, I'm not requesting authorization for experimental techniques. I'm requesting permission to have a conversation." I kept my voice steady, knowing that any sign of desperation would undermine my credibility. Traditional interrogation has failed because it's based on assumptions about Petrov's psychology that don't match his actual mental framework. But conversation isn't interrogation. It's information gathering that happens through understanding rather than pressure. Davis shook his head. Chun, this man is responsible for war crimes that make headlines worldwide. You're suggesting we treat him like a therapy patient instead of a terrorist. I'm suggesting we treat him like a human being whose psychology follows predictable patterns, I replied. Monsters aren't immune to psychological analysis, they're just people whose psychological development took paths that normal people find incomprehensible. Understanding those paths gives you leverage that intimidation can't provide. Morrison stood and walked to her window overlooking the CIA complex where hundreds of analysts worked daily to prevent exactly the kind of catastrophe Petrov was planning. I could see her weighing 11 American lives that had been saved through unconventional thinking against institutional pressure to maintain approved procedures. Chun, what makes you think your approach will succeed where 3 weeks of professional interrogation have failed? She asked without turning around. The question forced me to articulate something I'd never had to defend before. Ma'am, traditional interrogation assumes that fear is the most powerful human motivator. But fear only works when subjects believe interrogators can deliver consequences worse than whatever they're already facing. Petrov has survived Stalin's purges, Yugoslav civil wars, and 20 years of ethnic cleansing operations. There's nothing we can threaten him with that's worse than what he's already experienced. I paused, gathering my thoughts. But everyone has something they care about protecting. Everyone has beliefs or principles or memories that define their sense of self. Finding those psychological core elements gives you influence that doesn't depend on external threats. It depends on internal understanding. Thompson leaned forward. And you believe you can identify these core elements through conversation rather than pressure? I believe Petrov has already revealed them through 3 weeks of interrogation transcripts. He's been telling us who he is and what matters to him. We've been too focused on breaking him to notice what he's actually communicating. The decision hung in the air like smoke from an explosion, dangerous and impossible to ignore. Morrison was being asked to authorize an approach that violated every assumption about interrogation effectiveness, based on theories that had never been tested against subjects of Petrov's caliber. If my approach failed, hundreds of thousands of innocent people would die because she'd chosen empathy over aggression. But if traditional methods continued, those people would die anyway. Chun, you have 6 hours to review those transcripts and develop your approach, Morrison said, her voice carrying the careful tone of someone providing authorization while maintaining plausible deniability. After that, you'll have 1 session with Petrov. If you can't extract actionable intelligence about Operation Cleanse, we'll be forced to consider alternatives that none of us want to contemplate. I felt my heart rate spike as I realized Morrison was giving me exactly what I'd asked for, the opportunity to test everything I believed about human psychology against someone who'd spent decades learning to resist exactly that kind of analysis. The weight of responsibility was staggering. Hundreds of thousands of lives depending on my ability to understand the mind of someone whose actions suggested he'd abandoned basic humanity. As I gathered the transcripts and prepared to spend the next 6 hours learning everything Petrov had revealed about himself, I realized this was the moment my entire career had been building toward. Every interrogation, every success, every criticism from colleagues who dismissed my methods as too soft had led to this room, this subject. This chance to prove that understanding evil was more powerful than simply opposing it. The thick stack of transcripts felt like holding the weight of every assumption I'd ever challenged about intelligence work, about human nature, about the relationship between empathy and effectiveness. In 6 hours, I would either validate everything I believed about psychological analysis or confirm my superior's assessment that emotional intelligence was incompatible with national security requirements. But as I began reading Petrov's words, looking for patterns that 3 weeks of professional analysis had missed, I felt the familiar surge of confidence that came with approaching impossible problems through frameworks that others had never considered. The interrogation room at Langley was designed to intimidate. Concrete walls painted institutional gray, fluorescent lighting that cast harsh shadows, a metal table bolted to the floor, and chairs positioned to create psychological distance between interrogator and subject. Everything about the space communicated dominance and control, which was exactly why every previous session with Petrov had failed. I spent my first 20 minutes rearranging the furniture. I moved the chairs closer together, adjusted the lighting to reduce glare, and positioned myself at an angle that suggested conversation rather than confrontation. When the guards brought Petrov in, I was sitting casually with a cup of coffee and a second cup placed across from me, as if I were meeting a colleague rather than confronting a war criminal. Viktor Petrov looked exactly like his photographs, but seeing him in person revealed details that pictures couldn't capture. The way he carried himself with careful precision that suggested constant awareness of potential threats. The manner in which his eyes cataloged every detail of the room before acknowledging my presence. The micro-expressions that betrayed intelligence, far beyond what his interrogators had credited him with possessing. "Mr. Petrov, my name is Sarah Chen," I said in English, making no attempt to assert authority or dominance. "I brought you coffee. I wasn't sure how you prefer it, so I left it black." Petrov studied me for several seconds before responding. His English was heavily accented but precise, suggesting formal education rather than casual acquisition. "You are different from the others. They come here to break me. You come here to serve refreshments." "I come here to understand," I replied, taking a sip of my own coffee. "The others assume they know who you are based on what you've done. But actions are symptoms of thinking patterns, not the patterns themselves." Something flickered across Petrov's face, too quick to identify but significant enough to suggest I'd said something that resonated with his worldview. He reached for the coffee cup and held it with both hands, a gesture that seemed to provide psychological comfort rather than physical warmth. "Understanding," he repeated, as if testing the word's flavor. "This is interesting concept from American intelligence officer. Usually your people prefer judging." I'd identified my opening. Petrov's psychological profile had suggested someone who felt perpetually misunderstood, whose actions were motivated by frameworks that others dismissed without examination. He wasn't someone who craved approval, but he might respond to someone who demonstrated genuine interest in his perspective rather than immediate condemnation. "Judgment assumes I already know everything about your situation," I said. "But I don't understand what circumstances led someone with your intelligence to choose the path you've taken. That ignorance makes me less effective at predicting your future decisions." Petrov leaned back slightly, his posture suggesting increased comfort with the direction of our conversation. "You speak as if my choices were rational responses to circumstances rather than evidence of moral deficiency." "All human choices are rational within the psychological frameworks that generate them," I replied. "The question isn't whether your choices were moral, it's whether they were logical given your understanding of available alternatives." For the first time since entering the room, Petrov smiled. It wasn't a pleasant expression, but it suggested genuine engagement rather than the mechanical responses he'd provided to previous interrogators. I was approaching him as an intelligent person whose worldview deserved analysis rather than a monster whose motivations were irrelevant. "Miss Chen, you are either very naive or very clever," Petrov said. "Which assessment should I prefer?" "Whichever one makes you more willing to help me understand how your mind works," I replied honestly. "I'm not here to condemn or absolve you. I'm here to learn how someone with your capabilities processes complex decisions." Petrov was quiet for nearly 2 minutes, staring into his coffee as if it contained answers to questions he'd never been asked before. When he finally looked up, his expression had shifted toward something that might have been curiosity. "What would you like to understand about my decisions, Miss Chen?" The question represented a breakthrough that 3 weeks of aggressive interrogation hadn't achieved. Petrov was offering to engage with someone who approached him as a complex human being rather than a simple villain. But his willingness to talk didn't guarantee he would reveal anything useful about Operation Cleanse. I needed to identify psychological motivations that would make him want to share information that could prevent his planned attacks. "I'd like to understand what you're trying to accomplish through your work," I said. "Not the immediate tactical objectives, but the larger vision that makes those objectives feel necessary." Petrov's eyes sharpened with interest. "You assume my actions serve larger purposes rather than simple cruelty. People don't sustain 20 years of dangerous activity without believing their work serves important goals. Understanding those goals helps me understand how your mind evaluates costs and benefits." "Costs and benefits," Petrov repeated, seeming to savor the phrase. "You speak like economist rather than intelligence officer." I'd struck another psychological chord. Petrov responded to people who approached him as rational actor rather than irrational monster. His worldview was built around logical analysis of complex situations, even when that analysis led to conclusions others found morally reprehensible. "Economics assumes people make decisions based on maximizing desired outcomes," I said. "I'm trying to understand what outcomes you're trying to maximize." Petrov stood and walked to the room's single window, though the reinforced glass revealed nothing except the parking structure outside. His movement seemed designed to create thinking space rather than avoid the conversation. "Miss Chen, have you studied history of Balkans during 1990s? He asked without turning around. "I've read the reports and academic analyses," I replied. "But I imagine your perspective differs significantly from official accounts." "Official accounts describe symptoms without understanding disease," Petrov said, finally facing me again. "They catalog atrocities without examining circumstances. That made such actions seem reasonable to people who implemented them." I recognized the psychological pattern emerging from our conversation. Petrov saw himself as someone who understood complex realities that others oversimplified through moral frameworks. He believed his actions were logical responses to circumstances that conventional thinking couldn't properly analyze. This self-perception was the key to accessing information he'd withheld from aggressive interrogators. "What circumstances made your actions seem reasonable?" I asked. Petrov returned to his chair and leaned forward, his posture suggesting increased engagement. "Ethnic groups cannot coexist peacefully when resources are limited and historical. Grievances remain unresolved. Integration is pleasant fiction that ignores fundamental human tribalism. Separation through population transfer prevents larger conflicts that would kill far more people." The words were chilling in their casual delivery, but they revealed everything about how Petrov's mind worked. He'd convinced himself that ethnic cleansing was humanitarian intervention, that forced displacement prevented worse violence, that his brutality served greater good. Understanding this twisted logic was the key to predicting his future plans. And Operation Cleanse represents application of this philosophy to current situations? I asked. Petrov's eyes widened slightly, surprised that I'd connected his historical justifications to contemporary plans. He'd revealed more than he intended by explaining his worldview, and now I could see him calculating whether to continue the conversation or retreat into silence. "You are very clever, Miss Chen," he said slowly. "Perhaps too clever for your own safety." "My safety depends on preventing Operation Cleanse from proceeding," I replied. "Your philosophy suggests you believe forced separation prevents larger conflicts. But the populations you're targeting are already separated geographically. What conflict are you trying to prevent?" The question forced Petrov to confront contradictions in his own logic. If his previous actions were justified by preventing ethnic conflict through separation, then attacking already separated populations served different purposes that he hadn't acknowledged. I was asking him to explain motivations he might not have consciously examined. Petrov was quiet for several minutes, his fingers tracing patterns on the metal table while he processed the implications of my question. I could see internal struggle playing out across his features, psychological frameworks competing against each other as he tried to maintain consistency in his worldview. Economic migration creates new proximity problems, he finally said. Refugee populations in Western cities generate same tensions that caused original conflicts. Separation must be permanent to remain effective. The admission revealed the true scope of Operation Cleanse. Petrov wasn't planning to attack ethnic groups in their historical territories. He was targeting refugee communities that had already fled previous conflicts. His twisted logic suggested that allowing survivors to rebuild their lives elsewhere would eventually recreate the conditions that had originally justified ethnic cleansing. How many refugee communities are you planning to target? I asked, keeping my voice carefully neutral despite the horror of what he was describing. Sufficient numbers to demonstrate that geographical separation must be maintained permanently, Petrov replied, seeming almost relieved to finally articulate his complete philosophy to someone who wasn't immediately rejecting it as incomprehensible. Evil. And what numbers would constitute sufficient demonstration? Petrov met my eyes directly. 47 refugee centers across 6 countries, beginning with largest concentrations in Germany and Sweden. Operations commence in 72 hours, proceeding simultaneously to prevent defensive preparations. The room fell silent as the full magnitude of Operation Cleanse became clear. Petrov was planning coordinated attacks against refugee communities across Europe, targeting people who'd already survived ethnic cleansing once and were attempting to rebuild their lives in countries that had offered them sanctuary. The casualty projections Morrison had mentioned suddenly seemed conservative rather than catastrophic. Victor, I said, using his first name deliberately to maintain the personal connection we'd established. You've explained your logic, and I understand how you've reached these conclusions. But have you considered that attacking refugees might achieve the opposite of your stated goals? His expression sharpened with interest rather than defensiveness. Explain this assessment. Refugee communities represent proof that ethnic separation can lead to peaceful coexistence in new environments. Attacking them validates integration rather than separation by demonstrating that geographical distance isn't sufficient protection against ethnic violence. You'd be proving that your original philosophy was incomplete. I could see Petrov processing this analysis, his expression cycling through surprise, consideration, and something that might have been recognition. I'd identified a genuine contradiction in his worldview, forcing him to choose between psychological consistency and operational objectives. Miss Chen, you present interesting analytical framework, he said slowly. But theoretical consistency matters less than practical necessity. European governments must understand that accepting refugee populations creates permanent security obligations. Understood. But security obligations can be met through protection rather than elimination. Your operation would teach European governments that refugee populations are security risks rather than security responsibilities. The lesson reinforces separation without demonstrating that separation can be successful. Petrov stared at me for nearly a full minute, his mind clearly working through implications I'd raised that he hadn't previously considered. Finally, he smiled with what appeared to be genuine appreciation. You argue like philosopher rather than intelligence officer. Miss Chen, this conversation has been more intellectually stimulating than 3 weeks of amateur psychology from your colleagues. Thank you, Victor. Now help me understand the operational details so I can evaluate whether your theoretical framework can actually achieve its stated objectives. And for the next 4 hours, he did exactly that. By the time our session ended, I had 47 pages of handwritten notes containing detailed intelligence about Operation Cleanse that would have taken conventional interrogators months to extract, if they ever managed to get it at all. Petrov had provided safe house locations, operational timelines, weapon cache coordinates, communication protocols, and even the psychological profiles of team leaders he'd recruited for the attacks. He'd shared everything because our conversation had convinced him I was someone who understood the intellectual framework behind his planning. The transformation in Petrov during those 4 hours had been remarkable to witness. What started as cautious engagement evolved into something resembling professional consultation. He began treating me like a colleague whose analytical capabilities he respected, someone worthy of understanding the sophisticated planning that had gone into developing Operation Cleanse. His ego demanded recognition from someone intelligent, enough to appreciate his work. "Miss Chen, you have understanding that your colleagues lack," Petrov had said near the end of our session. "Most intelligence officers approach subjects like myself as puzzles to be solved through force. But psychological analysis requires intellectual respect for the subject's mental capabilities, even when their conclusions are morally objectionable." I'd carefully maintained that intellectual respect throughout our conversation, never expressing the revulsion I felt while listening to him describe plans for murdering thousands of innocent people. Professional effectiveness required separating emotional responses from analytical objectives. Understanding evil wasn't the same as accepting it, but understanding was essential for preventing it. When I finally emerged from the interrogation room, I found Morrison, Thompson, and Davis waiting in the observation area with expressions that combined astonishment and disbelief. They'd watched the entire session through closed-circuit television, witnessing something that contradicted every assumption they'd made about interrogation effectiveness. "Chen, how did you get him to reveal operational details that 3 weeks of professional interrogation couldn't extract?" Morrison asked, her voice carrying genuine amazement. "I convinced him that I was intellectually capable of understanding his decision-making framework," I replied, settling into a chair that felt strange after hours of intense psychological navigation. Petrov needed someone to recognize the sophistication of his planning. Traditional interrogation treated him like a mindless brute, which insulted his intelligence and motivated him to prove his intellectual superiority through resistance. Thompson shook his head slowly. "Chen, we watched you spend 4 hours having what looked like a philosophical discussion with a mass murderer. How does intellectual flattery translate into actionable intelligence?" The question revealed exactly why conventional approaches had failed so spectacularly. Thompson and his colleagues saw my session as flattery rather than strategic psychological engagement. They couldn't distinguish between manipulating someone's ego and understanding their cognitive architecture. "Sir, it wasn't flattery. It was recognition that Petrov's psychology follows predictable patterns that can be leveraged once you understand his self-concept and motivational framework. He sees himself as someone who makes difficult decisions that others are too weak or stupid to understand." Acknowledging that self-perception created trust that made him willing to share information. Davis consulted the notes he'd taken during the observation. "But Chen, you never directly questioned him about Operation Cleanse. You let him volunteer information during discussions about theoretical frameworks and historical precedents. How did you know he would reveal operational details?" "Because people like Petrov can't resist demonstrating their intellectual superiority when they encounter someone who might be capable of appreciating their work. His entire self-image is built around being smarter than everyone around him." Proving that intelligence became more important than maintaining operational security. Morrison leaned forward, her expression intense. "Chen, The intelligence you extracted is extraordinary. Safe house locations that we've been searching for months. Weapon cache coordinates that will prevent multiple terrorist attacks. Communication. Protocols that will allow us to intercept planning for future operations. How confident are you that this information is accurate? I'd anticipated this question and spent considerable time during the session testing Petrov's honesty through cross-references and consistency checks. Ma'am, Petrov was telling the truth. His psychological profile suggests someone who takes pride in precision and accuracy. Providing false information would undermine his self-image as someone whose planning is superior to American intelligence capabilities. The secure phone on Morrison's desk buzzed with the priority tone reserved for emergency communications. She answered immediately, putting the call on speaker so everyone could hear the conversation. Morrison here. Yes, sir. We have actionable intelligence on Operation Cleanse. 47 target locations across 6 countries. Operational timeline beginning in 68 hours. Yes, sir. Complete details including weapon cache locations and communication protocols. Agent Chen extracted the information through successful interrogation. I could hear voices conferring in the background of the call, suggesting that senior leadership was coordinating immediate responses based on the intelligence I'd provided. Within minutes, counter-terrorism units across Europe would be mobilizing to prevent attacks that could have killed thousands of innocent people. Ma'am, we need immediate coordination with Europol and national security services in Germany, Sweden, Netherlands, France, Belgium, and Austria. The voice on the phone continued. Also need tactical teams positioned at the weapon cache coordinates. Agent Chen provided. How confident are we in this intelligence? Morrison looked at me before responding. Sir, Agent Chen's assessment is that the source was completely forthcoming. The information includes operational details that couldn't have been fabricated and cross-references with existing intelligence in ways that confirm accuracy. Outstanding work. This intelligence will save thousands of lives. Agent Chen is to be commended for extraordinary performance under extreme pressure. As Morrison ended the call, I realized that my career had fundamentally changed in the space of 6 hours. The same empathetic approach that colleagues had dismissed as too soft for serious intelligence work had just prevented one of the most devastating terrorist attacks in European history. The institutional assumptions about interrogation effectiveness were about to be challenged by results that couldn't be ignored or explained away. But the personal vindication felt secondary to the knowledge that 47 refugee communities would wake up tomorrow morning without knowing how close they'd come to annihilation. Families who'd already survived ethnic cleansing once would continue building new lives in countries that had offered them sanctuary. Children who'd grown up hearing stories about violence they'd escaped would never experience the nightmares their parents remembered. Chen, I owe you an apology, Thompson said, breaking the silence that had followed Morrison's call. I was wrong about your methods. What you accomplished in 6 hours is unprecedented in my experience with high-value interrogations. Sir, my methods only worked because conventional approaches had failed, I replied. Petrov had already proven he could resist aggressive tactics. The only remaining option was understanding his psychology well enough to convince him that cooperation served his interests better than resistance. Davis nodded slowly. Chen, you made cooperation feel like intellectual collaboration rather than submission to authority. He was sharing information with someone he respected rather than surrendering to someone he feared. Morrison stood and walked to her window overlooking the CIA complex where analysts were already processing the intelligence I'd provided, coordinating with international partners to prevent attacks across multiple countries simultaneously. The scope of Operation Cleanse was staggering, but the scope of the prevention effort would be equally impressive. Chen, effective immediately, you're being reassigned to lead the new Psychological Intelligence Division, Morrison announced. Your methods are going to be studied, refined, and implemented across the entire intelligence community. What you've proven today changes everything about how we approach high-stakes interrogations. The promotion felt surreal after months of professional exile, but I understood that institutional change often required dramatic demonstrations of effectiveness that couldn't be dismissed or minimized. Preventing Operation Cleanse wasn't just a successful interrogation, it was proof that empathetic intelligence gathering could achieve results that traditional aggression couldn't match. Ma'am, I'd like to request that psychological analysis become standard preparation for all high-value interrogations, I said. Understanding subject psychology before applying any interrogation techniques would prevent the kind of tactical mistakes that made Petrov resistant to conventional approaches. Granted. What else do you need to implement your methods more broadly? I thought about all the times my approach had been dismissed as too soft, too emotional, too concerned with understanding rather than dominating. Permission to train interrogators in psychological analysis techniques that prioritize understanding over intimidation. Most intelligence officers have never learned to read micro-expressions, identify cognitive frameworks, or build psychological rapport with hostile subjects. Morrison nodded. You'll have whatever resources you need. The results speak for themselves. 6 months later, I found myself briefing members of the Senate Intelligence Committee about psychological interrogation techniques that had prevented 14 separate terrorist attacks across 3 continents. The methods my colleagues had, once dismissed as too emotional, were now standard protocol for high-value interrogations throughout the intelligence community. Petrov himself had become an unexpected asset, providing ongoing intelligence about international terrorist networks in exchange for intellectual engagement with analysts who treated him as a valuable source rather than a defeated enemy. His cooperation had led to the disruption of criminal organizations that had operated successfully for decades. The briefing room fell silent as I concluded my presentation about psychological intelligence gathering. Senator Williams, the committee chair, leaned forward with an expression of someone processing information that challenged fundamental assumptions about national security operations. Agent Chen, you're telling us that empathy is more effective than intimidation for extracting intelligence from hostile subjects? Senator, I'm telling you that understanding human psychology is more effective than ignoring it. Empathy is just one tool in a larger framework that prioritizes psychological analysis over physical or emotional pressure. Senator Rodriguez consulted her notes before responding. Agent Chen, your success rate with this approach has been extraordinary. But how do we ensure that intelligence officers maintain appropriate emotional distance from subjects who may be manipulating their empathy for strategic purposes? The question reflected exactly the kind of thinking that had kept effective psychological techniques marginalized for so long. Senator, professional empathy isn't emotional involvement. It's analytical understanding of psychological frameworks that govern human decision-making. Understanding how someone thinks doesn't mean agreeing with their conclusions or becoming personally invested in their welfare. As I answered questions about methods that had once seemed too radical for consideration, I thought about all the intelligence officers who'd been told their emotional intelligence was incompatible with national security work. How many breakthroughs had been prevented by institutional assumptions about strength and effectiveness? How many lives could have been saved if empathy had been recognized as a strategic asset rather than a professional liability? The committee concluded with unanimous approval for expanding psychological intelligence training throughout the federal law enforcement and intelligence communities. What had started as a desperate attempt to extract information from one war criminal had evolved into fundamental reform of how America approached some of its most critical national security challenges. Walking out of the Capitol building that afternoon, I realized that being called too emotional had been the greatest compliment my career could have received. It just took everyone else 20 years to understand why. 3 years after that conversation, with Viktor Petrov, changed everything. I stood in the Pentagon briefing room facing an audience of senior military leaders from every branch of service. The presentation screen behind me displayed statistics that would have seemed impossible. When I was first told I was too emotional for serious intelligence work, psychological interrogation techniques had achieved a 94% success rate across 312 high-value interrogations, prevented 67 terrorist attacks, and led to the dismantling of 23 international criminal organizations. General Patricia Hayes, the first female chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, had requested this briefing personally after reviewing intelligence reports that credited psychological analysis with breakthroughs traditional methods had failed to achieve for decades. Her presence in the room represented institutional change that extended far beyond interrogation techniques. The military was finally recognizing that different types of intelligence could produce superior results when applied by officers who understood human psychology as thoroughly as they understood weapon systems. Dr. Chen, General Hayes said, using the title I'd earned through the doctorate in psychology the military had encouraged me to pursue. Your methods have fundamentally altered how we approach intelligence gathering. But I want to understand something that goes beyond operational effectiveness. How did emotional intelligence become such a powerful tool for national security? The question forced me to reflect on everything that had changed since that morning. When Morrison first told me about Petrov, my understanding of emotional intelligence had evolved from instinctive empathy into sophisticated psychological analysis that could be taught, replicated, and improved through systematic study. What had once been dismissed as weakness was now recognized as advanced strategic thinking. General emotional intelligence provides access to decision-making frameworks that purely analytical approaches can't reach. I began clicking to a slide that showed brain scans comparing emotional and rational processing. Every human decision involves both logical assessment and emotional evaluation. Traditional interrogation tries to overwhelm the logical processes through pressure, but ignores the emotional processes that actually determine behavior. I advanced to the next slide, showing success rates for different interrogation approaches across various subject categories. When you understand how someone's emotions influence their logic, you can predict their responses and identify psychological leverage points that don't depend on external threats. Emotional intelligence isn't about feelings, it's about understanding the complete psychological architecture that governs human decision-making. Colonel James Martinez, the new Director of Military Intelligence, raised his hand. Dr. Chen, how do we ensure that officers trained in these techniques maintain appropriate professional boundaries? There's concern that empathetic approaches might compromise objectivity or create inappropriate relationships with hostile subjects. The question reflected lingering institutional anxiety about emotional engagement, even when that engagement had proven dramatically more effective than traditional alternatives. Colonel, professional empathy requires psychological discipline that's actually more demanding than emotional detachment. Understanding someone's psychology doesn't mean agreeing with their conclusions or becoming personally invested in their welfare. It means maintaining analytical clarity while accessing emotional intelligence that enhances rather than compromises professional judgment. I clicked to a case study slide that showed the breakdown of intelligence gathered through psychological techniques versus traditional methods. The key distinction is between emotional involvement and emotional understanding. Emotional involvement compromises professional judgment by creating personal investment in outcomes. Emotional understanding enhances professional judgment by providing access to psychological information that purely rational analysis can't reveal. Admiral Robert Chen, no relation despite the shared surname, consulted his notes before asking the next question. Dr. Chen, your success with Petrov has become legendary within intelligence circles. But how do we know these techniques will prove effective against subjects from different cultural backgrounds or psychological profiles? The question addressed legitimate concerns about the universality of psychological analysis across diverse subject populations. Admiral, emotional intelligence techniques adapt to cultural differences rather than override them. Understanding how cultural frameworks shape individual psychology is part of the analytical process. An approach that works with a Serbian war criminal might not work with a Middle Eastern terrorist, but the underlying principle of psychological analysis remains consistent across cultural boundaries. I advanced to a slide showing successful interrogations across different cultural, religious, and ideological backgrounds. The key is understanding that culture influences the expression of psychology rather than eliminating it. Everyone has emotional frameworks that govern their decision-making, but those frameworks develop within cultural contexts that must be understood and respected for analysis to be effective. General Hayes stood and walked to the window overlooking the Pentagon courtyard where military personnel from every service branch worked daily to protect American interests worldwide. Dr. Chen, beyond the immediate operational benefits, what broader implications do your methods have for military leadership and training? The question invited me to address something I'd been thinking about for months as psychological intelligence. Techniques gained acceptance throughout the military establishment. General, emotional intelligence has applications that extend far beyond interrogation. Understanding the psychological frameworks that govern human decision-making enhances leadership effectiveness, improves unit cohesion, and provides strategic advantages in any situation involving human interaction. I clicked to a slide showing preliminary results from leadership training programs that incorporated psychological analysis techniques. Military leaders who understand how emotions influence decision-making are more effective at motivating personnel, resolving conflicts, and building relationships with local populations during overseas deployments. Emotional intelligence enhances every aspect of military service that involves working with other human beings. Colonel Sarah Williams, the Army's Chief of Personnel Development, leaned forward with obvious interest. Dr. Chen, are you suggesting that emotional intelligence should become standard training for all military officers? Colonel, I'm suggesting that emotional intelligence is already essential for military effectiveness. We're just now beginning to acknowledge its importance and provide systematic training that develops these capabilities deliberately rather than leaving them to chance. I paused, choosing my next words carefully. The military has always recognized that understanding the enemy is crucial for strategic success. Emotional intelligence simply extends that understanding to include psychological factors that influence behavior. The briefing continued for another hour, covering training protocols, implementation timelines, and resource requirements for expanding psychological intelligence training throughout the military establishment. The institutional enthusiasm was remarkable considering how recently these same techniques had been dismissed as incompatible with military culture. As the meeting concluded, General Hayes approached me with an expression that combined professional respect and personal curiosity. Dr. Chen, off the record, how does it feel to have proven that everything your colleagues initially dismissed about your approach was actually valuable? The question touched on something I'd been processing throughout my career transformation. General, honestly, it feels like validation of something I always knew, but couldn't prove until circumstances provided the right test case. The frustrating part wasn't being told I was wrong, it was knowing I was right but lacking opportunities to demonstrate effectiveness. And now? Now I have junior officers telling me they're interested in military service because they see emotional intelligence being valued rather than dismissed. That feels more important than personal vindication. I gathered my presentation materials, thinking about all the young women who'd contacted me after reading about psychological intelligence techniques in military journals. The institutional change matters more than individual recognition. 6 months after the Pentagon briefing, I found myself back at Fort Meade, conducting advanced psychological analysis training for the Army's newest intelligence officers. The class included 12 women and 8 men, a gender ratio that would have been impossible before emotional intelligence gained recognition as essential military capability. Lieutenant Jessica Torres, a recent West Point graduate, approached me after the morning session with a question that brought back memories of my own early struggles with institutional bias. "Ma'am, some of the senior NCOs are saying that psychological techniques work better for female interrogators because women are naturally more empathetic. How do I respond to suggestions that my success depends on gender rather than training?" The question revealed that institutional change remained incomplete despite official recognition of psychological intelligence value. "Lieutenant, empathy isn't a gender-specific trait. It's a learnable skill that requires training and practice, regardless of who develops it. Some of our most effective psychological analysts are men who've learned to read micro-expressions and understand emotional frameworks through systematic study." I pulled up training results that showed success rates across gender lines. The key is professional development rather than natural ability. Male and female officers achieve similar success rates when they receive proper training in psychological analysis techniques. Gender stereotypes about emotional intelligence are actually counterproductive because they suggest these skills can't be developed through systematic effort. Lieutenant Torres nodded, but I could see she was still processing the implications of institutional attitudes that hadn't caught up with policy changes. "Ma'am, how do you maintain confidence in your methods when people suggest they're working for the wrong reasons?" "Focus on results rather than interpretations," I replied. "Your job is saving lives and protecting national security through effective intelligence gathering. How people explain your success matters less than whether you actually succeed. Let your work speak for itself while you continue developing capabilities that enhance your effectiveness." The conversation reminded me of my own journey from being dismissed as too emotional to leading the division responsible for training the next generation of intelligence officers. Institutional change was a gradual process that required both policy reform and cultural evolution. Policy could be changed through demonstrated effectiveness, but culture required individual officers who embodied new approaches until they became normal rather than exceptional. That afternoon, I received a secure communication from Viktor Petrov, who remained in federal custody, but continued providing intelligence through the psychological rapport we'd established. His message was brief but significant. "Dr. Chen, news. Reports indicate that refugee communities I targeted are thriving in their new homes. Perhaps forced separation was insufficient solution after all. Your analytical framework has proven more accurate than my operational assumptions." The admission represented something unprecedented in my experience with captured subjects. Petrov was acknowledging that extended engagement with someone who challenged his worldview had led him to reconsider fundamental assumptions about human nature and social organization. Psychological analysis hadn't just extracted intelligence from him, it had provided him with alternative frameworks for understanding the world that were less destructive than his original beliefs. I shared Petrov's message with Dr. Elizabeth Hartley, who'd become my deputy director and closest collaborator in developing psychological intelligence curricula. "Sarah, this represents something we hadn't anticipated when we started this work. Long-term psychological engagement might actually rehabilitate subjects rather than simply extracting information from them." "The implications are staggering," I replied. "If psychological analysis can change how hostile subjects understand the world, it might prevent future criminal activity rather than simply gathering intelligence about past actions." Hartley nodded thoughtfully. "We're looking at the possibility that empathetic engagement could transform enemies into assets through intellectual persuasion rather than coercion." That changes everything about how we think about intelligence, gathering, and national security. The conversation highlighted how my approach had evolved beyond simply proving that emotional intelligence could extract information from resistant subjects. Psychological analysis was revealing possibilities for transforming conflicts through understanding, rather than simply winning them through superior force or intelligence capabilities. 5 years after my session with Petrov, President Chen, relation, despite our shared surname, invited me to the White House to receive the Presidential Medal of Freedom for contributions to national security through innovations in intelligence gathering. The ceremony took place in the East Room, attended by intelligence community leaders, military officials, and academic researchers who contributed to expanding psychological analysis throughout government operations. Dr. Chen's work has fundamentally altered how America approaches some of our most critical national security challenges, President Chen announced during the presentation. Her recognition that emotional intelligence could enhance rather than compromise professional effectiveness has saved thousands of lives and prevented attacks that could have destabilized entire regions. Standing in the White House, wearing the Medal of Freedom that represented recognition for work that had once been dismissed as too soft for serious consideration, I thought about all the junior officers who'd contacted me over the years seeking advice about developing emotional intelligence capabilities despite institutional skepticism. The medal wasn't just personal recognition, it was validation for everyone who'd been told their empathetic nature was incompatible with military service. The reception following the ceremony included conversations with researchers from universities nationwide who were developing psychological analysis programs based on techniques I'd pioneered through necessity rather than academic study. Dr. Michael Thompson from Stanford University approached me with results from studies showing that emotional intelligence training enhanced leadership effectiveness across every measured parameter. Dr. Chen, your work has implications that extend far beyond intelligence gathering, he said, consulting research data he'd brought to share. Military units led by officers trained in psychological analysis show improved morale, reduced conflict, enhanced performance under stress, and better relationships with local populations during overseas deployments. Emotional intelligence is revolutionizing military effectiveness at every organizational level. The research confirmed something I'd suspected since my early experiences with empathetic interrogation techniques. Understanding human psychology enhanced every aspect of military service that involved working with other people, which meant virtually every aspect of military service. The institutional resistance I'd encountered hadn't just been wrong about interrogation. It had been wrong about the fundamental nature of military effectiveness. As the reception concluded and I prepared to return to my responsibilities at the National Defense University, where I now served as Dean of the new School of Psychological Intelligence, I reflected on how completely my career had been transformed. By refusing to accept that emotional intelligence was incompatible with national security work, the woman walking out of the White House that evening was fundamentally different from the one who'd been told she was too emotional for serious intelligence work 8 years earlier. But the core beliefs that had motivated my approach hadn't changed. I still believed that understanding people was more powerful than intimidating them, that empathy enhanced rather than compromised professional judgment, and that some problems could only be solved by people willing to approach them with intellectual courage rather than conventional thinking. The difference was that now the institution agreed with me. What had once been dismissed as weakness was now recognized as strategic advantage. What had once been characterized as too soft was now understood as sophisticated psychological capability. What had once been seen as feminine limitation was now valued as human enhancement that improved performance regardless of gender. But perhaps most importantly, junior officers now had institutional support for developing emotional intelligence capabilities rather than being told to suppress them. The next generation of military leaders would grow up understanding that psychological analysis was essential professional skill rather than personal weakness that needed to be overcome. The future of national security increasingly depended on understanding human behavior in all its complexity, and emotional intelligence would be central to that understanding. The transformation was complete, but the work was just beginning. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.